Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome. My name is Maurizio Benazzo.
My name is Zaya Benazzo. Welcome, everyone.
We are speaking to you from the unceded territory of the South Palm and coastal Milwaukee indigenous tribes, currently namely called Sebastopol, Northern California. Yeah, and the title of the panel is Minds Under Siege, Weaponizing Trauma for War. And I want to introduce you to our moderator, Cecilie Surasky, that she will be moderating the panel today. Cecilie, she's a storyteller and a long-time movement builder, a former deputy director of Jewish Voices for Peace and the current director of communication and narrative at Othering and Belonging. So, Cecilie, it's a joy and an honor to have you with us and looking forward to you driving this conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Cecilie, for your strong and clear voice for truth speaking, for justice, and for all you have done to support the movement. So welcome and thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much, Zaya and Maurizio, Gabor and Naomi, for this opportunity to have a really extraordinary and fiercely honest conversation. I'm sitting here, I'm at the Othering and Belonging Institute at the University of California at Berkeley. These are two greats. I can't imagine two better people to have this conversation with. The great writer activist Naomi Klein, who most recently wrote Doppelganger, and of course Dr. Gabor Maté, who has written with his son Daniel, The Myth of Normal, Trauma, Illness, and Healing in a Toxic Culture. For those of you who are new to this series, this discussion continues Sand's exploration of trauma, its nature, its impact on our bodies, future generations, how it shapes families, nations, and crucially, how we can move towards healing. Zaya and Maurizio, you've beautifully captured Dr. Maté's work in the film The Wisdom of Trauma. I highly recommend that people see this, which really looked at trauma at the individual level in many ways. And then When Olive Trees Weep, which documents the systematic trauma that is inflicted by the Israeli government on Palestinians. Today, we are going to explore ideas that are raised in Naomi's really groundbreaking October 24th, 2024 article, How Israel Has Made Trauma a Weapon of War. We will examine the manipulation of Jewish trauma and confront crucial, and I think for us on this panel, very deeply personal questions about how a state that was built by survivors of expulsions, pogroms, and genocide, a state that has proclaimed over and over, never again, could go on to commit genocide over the last 15 months in Gaza. And I don't use that word lightly. It is the word that the world's human rights experts recognize as appropriate. And I also say this recognizing that the story goes back much further than the last 15 months. And we'll get into some of that. And while this might seem like a conversation that's about Israel and Jews and Palestinians, it's not only that, and not just because it's the United States that has supported and paid for this war. These are questions that every single one of us must confront in a world that is built on multiple histories of terror, where the past and present collide, where the experience of trauma, grief, isolation, and loss is increasingly just a breath away from every person on the planet. Our greatest hope for survival is to turn towards each other instead of on each other, and we must learn how to get ourselves out of cycles of dehumanization. One of the most potent technologies we have for healing our deepest wounds is to tell stories about them, so we can make sense and meaning of our suffering as a way not just to heal ourselves, but to prevent the suffering of others. And it is in that spirit of deep care and profound love for our Palestinian siblings and our Jewish siblings and our Lebanese siblings and all of our siblings, and our recognition that our liberation is deeply entwined, that we are going to be engaging in this very, very vulnerable, fiercely honest conversation. I also want to say, I want to just dedicate this discussion as we begin to the countless women, men, and children and living beings who have lost their lives, to those who are reunited with their families today, those who are struggling to survive and rebuild, and who will go on enduring, who need our support, to our ancestors who have endured the unimaginable and whose wisdom guides us, and to future generations who deserve better and in whose names we must do better. So I'll just start by opening up and say, we're friends here. I got us started. You don't really need me now to continue. I will ask you questions to move along. We will go for about an hour. And at the end of that hour, we will take, or 45 minutes. And at the top of the hour, we will take questions from the audience. My only concern or request is that we move towards, I would say, instructions for world building and healing for our audience. I know it's not that simple, but it is very easy to have a conversation like this and not know where to go. You are the people, I think, who can also help us know where to go. So I want to start with Gabor, both to establish some of the terms when we talk about collective trauma and trauma, what it is, what it does to us, and the specifics of the story. This is a story of the weaponization of Jewish trauma and what you can offer for that.
Sure. Well, thank you, Cecilie. Let me begin by a quote from you that is cited by Naomi in her book, Doppelganger, where you said that it's re-traumatization, not remembering. There's a difference. So there's a difference in remembering, recalling what happened, and then how we employ that memory, or how we are affected by that memory, or how we embody that memory. In the yogic understanding of the intellect, there are different components. There's memory, there's discernment, there's awareness, and then there's identity. And identity is what we identify with. And it's identity that actually wields the intellect. So that how we identify and what we identify with will very much determine the uses to which we put our capacity to think. Let me give you an example. Naomi wrote a wonderful article for The Guardian, I think it was October the 5th, and she had a response. I don't know if you saw it, but it's from somebody, his name is Noam Schimmel, and he's a lecturer in global studies with an emphasis on human rights at the University of California, Berkeley. So exactly where you're at, Cecilie. This guy teaches human rights. And his response to Naomi's article was, it is not for Naomi Klein from her place of privilege and safety, far from the sadistic violence and destruction of October the 7th, to lecture survivors on how to tell their story, to whom and in what context and forms. But this guy's got an intellect, but he's completely enslaved to his identity as a Jewish victim. And that's all he can see. Now, it's really interesting how that works, because he lives in a place of safety. He lives far away from Palestine. He lives far away from Israel. And he thinks it's perfectly okay for him to have opinions. But not for Naomi. Where does that come from? It comes from an identification with a sense of Jewish victimization. So identity and what we identify with drives how we think about something. And that identity is often unconscious. So that's the first point. The second point is, if I said to you, Cecilie, there were over 1,200 Jewish people killed as a result of a violent assault, what do you think of? Well, we think of October the 7th. And we're constantly told that October the 7th was the largest murder, or the most, it's the greatest crime committed against Jews since the Holocaust, since the Nazi genocide. Well, let me tell you something. Between 1976 and 1983, in Argentina, Nearly 1,300 Jews were killed by the Argentinian junta. That was supported by Israel and by the Americans. Nobody talks about those Jews. Jews made up 1% of the Argentinian population. They made up 12% of the victims of the junta that were killed. Do you hear anybody ever talking about it? Because they don't fit in to the identification of Jews being victimized for being Jews. And actually, it's entirely possible that it was even a larger number. There may be even up to 3,000 Jews that were killed by the Argentinian junta. Nobody ever talks about it because it doesn't fit into the trauma narrative of Jews as Jews. They were killed because they were progressive, and the fascist regime saw them as a threat.
So how far back does this trauma narrative go as a form of identity? Growing up in Jewish communities, we learn about chosenness. There's an exceptionalism, and the exceptionalism shows up. And by the way, Judaism, we're not the only people, not the only religion that has that kind of a framework at all. It also shows up in how we talk about the Holocaust, that it is uniquely and utterly metaphysically exceptional.
Yeah.
And of course, all genocides are different, but is the mass murder of Jews, of humans, exceptional?
So I have a book here called Endless Holocausts, Mass Death in the History of the United States Empire. The Jewish identification with persecution is really interesting. First of all, if you look at the Old Testament, it's significantly a genocidal document. The Jews were commanded to kill all the citizens, all the inhabitants of Palestine. Number one. Number two, during the holiday of oh gosh, no, it's not Pesach. It's which is the holiday when we rattle things and Purim, yeah, Purim. 75,000 Persians were killed. And this is celebrated as a wonderful achievement. But we're still always the victims. Now, here's the reality. I can't go into all the history, but the whole Zionist story, and it's actually a story that was developed in the 19th, 20th centuries, that the Jews were one people, one nation, that were expelled from Palestine, and were wandering around the world hoping to get back to their homeland. It never happened. There was no Jewish expulsion. Already at the time when the second temple was destroyed in 70 AD, or when 80 years later or 60 years later there was the Bar Kokhba revolt, most Jews were living outside Palestine and had been for hundreds of years. So it was never the case that the Jews were one people living in one land. There were Jewish kingdoms in Arabia in the 4th and 5th centuries, Jewish kingdoms. There were Jews living in India 2,000 years ago. There were Jews that were converted to Judaism in the 7th, 8th centuries in Europe, the Khazars. So to argue that there was this one people always persecuted that came from this land is just not true. And to argue that all these people that were converted to Judaism, which is probably the most Jews in the world, historically speaking, have the right to come back to this ancient homeland, it's a modern concoction. And in order to justify that concoction, they had to create this image of this one persecuted people that were expelled from that land. And one more thing I'll tell you here, really interesting. In 1922, I think it was, David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, at that time a prominent Zionist leader, and Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, who became the second president of Israel, they wrote a book together. It was about Palestine. And they pointed out that a lot of the Palestinian villages have ancient Hebrew names. And they argued that the original inhabitants of the land never left Palestine, most of them. It's just that some of them converted to Islam. And so that the Palestinians, many of them, particularly the Fellahin living on the land, were actually descendants of ancient Jews. And they documented this in their book. But then they had to give that one up, and nobody talks about that anymore because it collides with the narrative of this one people. So what I'm saying is that the narrative of this traumatized, expelled, exiled people is itself a modern concoction. And it's necessary, and as Naomi points out in her article, to create this trauma perspective in order to justify the ongoing colonization of Palestine. So in other words, even that Jewish identity as one people constantly persecuted is itself a concoction. Not that there wasn't all kinds of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish violence throughout history. Of course there was. But it's much more subtle and complicated than that. And finally, I just say that there have been genocides of the Armenians. There were genocide of the Chinese in Indonesia. There was the person, Raphael Lemkin, the Jewish professor who came up with the term genocide. He identified the extermination of a heretic sect called the Albigensians in France in the 13th century as genocide. So the uniqueness is itself a concoction. Mm-hmm. I think I'll stop here.
Naomi, you've been writing and thinking about these questions that Gabor raises for a really long time, and you've probably also lived them. What does this raise for you? And this question about the flattening of narratives, the use of narratives, the creation of identities?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm very, very honored to be with you and part of this thriving community, which I think we can tell by how many people have tuned in and are also watching on other platforms. So thank you to the SANS team for building this beautiful community. And I want to acknowledge that I'm speaking from unceded Musqueam territory, unceded and unsurrendered, on the campus of University of British Columbia. And just really happy to be in conversation with two old friends who I've learned so much from. And would talk to them under any circumstances, no matter who was listening, and often do. I think that just what Gabor ended on there is really, to me, the scene of the crime, right? Around the foundational misremembering of the Holocaust as absolutely outside of time and space, being why we are stuck in what I'm increasingly, I think, Cec, you referred to it as kind of a loop, right? But we might also think of it as this sort of spiraling down, because a loop implies endless repetition in a way that doesn't change, but actually what we're seeing is a compounding, right? So that it isn't static, that as it repeats, the victims become victimizers, with all of the trauma of surviving genocide playing out in the way they become victimizers. And then there's nothing to stop it from continuing again if we don't really confront the roots of what drives genocide in the first place, right? And so I think that Gabor's taking us way further back to understanding that eliminationist, annihilatory impulse, right? Which I think does have to do probably with concepts of chosenness, purity, that are not unique to our sacred text, that are in a lot of in arguably all the monotheistic religions, right? That have this kind of need to have the single one God and wipe out all the others, right? But what I will say about the moment the way the Holocaust was deliberately misunderstood, right? It was not that nobody was pointing out that there had been other genocides, that there were other groups targeted, that the Nazis directly learned from, and that you could draw a straight line from the Nama and Herero genocide in what is now Namibia to the concentration camps inside Germany under Nazi rule. And what by a straight line, I mean that, you know, that Hitler read the race law developed in Germany's African colonies by Eugene Fischer when he was writing Mein Kampf, cited him. Fischer joins the Nazi party and trains Mengele. Like, it's not like, oh, 6 degrees of separation. It's no degrees of separation from from a genocide inflicted on Africans in between 1904 and 1908, and the genocide inflicted by some of the same Germans, right? But now under another regime 30 years later, right? So why was that denied? Because it wasn't that nobody pointed it out. So many Black scholars, Aimé Césaire, W.E.B. Du Bois, in India, Nehru in the 1930s was saying, this thing you're calling fascism is imperialism and colonialism, but now inflicted inside Europe. And you had Césaire, who was theorizing the way colonialism corrupts the colonizer, right? And that it was inevitable that it would come home to Europe. And of course, it's, as Gabor pointed out, it started in Europe. So why was it misremembered if people were pointing it out at the time? Like, who's in, like, it was not like, oh, we didn't know. It's a suppressed history. It's a buried history. It's a denied history, because what would like, if we were to really confront what the Nazis learned from settler colonialism in the Americas, settler colonialism in Africa, in Asia, then it would have meant that the heroes of the narrative, right, the Americans, the British, would have to confront themselves in the mirror, right? I mean, this is why Césaire said Hitler is your double, he's your twin, right? I mean, this is what got me interested in it when I was writing Doppelganger, was all this language of twinness in the anti-colonial understandings of fascism when it erupts in the 30s and 40s in Europe. And so none of this was part of my Holocaust education. Like, I came to it embarrassingly late. But I increasingly feel like this is the work of remembering. It is about putting the Holocaust back in time and space and really getting at the logics, because if you don't confront the way that colonialism and imperialism creates the Nazi project, then it becomes thinkable to call the creation of a settler colonial state in Palestine reparations for that, because you have exceptionalized it and said, actually, these atrocities, this horror, these crimes against humanity are about this mystical Jew hatred, right? It's about it. It's something outside of history. It's primordial, right? And you have like people like Claude Lanzmann talking about how there needs to be a ring of fire around the Holocaust. So there's a forbidding of comparison. And we're told that any comparison is de facto trivialization, right? So I think we need to understand that this was a project. This was a political, economic project, I think, to protect the spoils of colonialism. And it brings us to this deep, deep confrontation with the centrality of colonial pillage and theft to the core injustices of our world that are playing out in this moment, where you have Donald Trump coming to power. I mean, something like that may have gotten lost in the deluge of news yesterday was that he announced that the highest peak in North America, in Alaska, which had its indigenous name restored under Obama officially, would go back to its colonial name, right? So it's a rage at remembering, like, and so like these are all parts of the same war, in a sense, the same battle of worldviews, this banning of books about history in the United States, that no, we will put our colonial name back on the mountain. We will not understand what is beneath our country, right? Is just this clinging to to false histories. So I think the other thing I would just say in response to what Gabor was saying was, Gabor, when you were talking about how some of these core stories about Jews like always having been persecuted, right, and always wandering the world, like I can feel like the ground shaking underneath me, right, because this is so much a part of Jewish education, right, and I'm sure some people tuning in probably felt a bit of that sort of vertigo of like, well, wait a minute, if I lose that story, who am I? Like, because we build our identities around stories, right? And when you have a story since before you can remember, right? And then somebody comes along and says, actually, that story is wrong. I think that there's like the best case scenario is you feel a little bit wobbly, right? But I think a lot of people get angry when their stories get taken away, when their stories get challenged. And so I would just say, we are made of stories, and that if we are going to destabilize some of our foundational narratives, which we must, I think we also need to take very seriously the work of telling news stories, right? Like telling news stories that can inspire us, that can map our way out of this. Because it's a big deal to take away the stories that make up the self. And so that's just what I'm thinking about, is like, oh, we need to do this. We need to do both at the same time, or we'll end up with more backlash.
Gabor, following on that and your response, not only this question of what are these news stories we can tell, and living in deep shame is not a life-sustaining story. We have to do something, but also what does it do to a person or a people to be inculcated in the story that Naomi is describing and that you are describing, that like Judeo-pessimism, the world hates you and will always hate you. What does that do to people?
We can't hear you, Gabor.
Yeah.
The question we could always ask ourselves, and we don't ask it enough, either personally, in personal relationships, or tussles with the world, or collectively, is who are we if we're not our stories? In other words, who are we essentially, quite apart from our stories, regardless of what stories we tell? Who are we without that story? And Naomi is quite right. Most people create their identity stories that.
Oh,
Gabor.
So,
Gabor, we're losing you.
which is why, for example, yeah.
Yeah, if you
Okay,
can
I'm
go
sorry,
back.
there's some bad connection here. Am I back now?
Yeah,
And I'll turn off my, or can you hear me now?
Yes.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just speak anonymously. Okay. So one thing is to ask, who are we without our stories? And when you get down to it, we're human beings. And, in the Old Testament, when Moses asks God, who are you? He says, I am that I am. And he doesn't give any stories around it. It's just that I am. That's a deep spiritual question that most people don't tackle. Who are they outside their stories? But if you're going to tell stories, we're going to have to let go of identifications. Identification means literally idem in Latin means the same, and facere, to make. So when we identify, we make ourselves the same as a story.
Mm.
And in order to get at the truth, we have to disidentify.
Mm.
So it's not surprising. I mean, there's been all kinds of, I mean, Naomi knows this, and you know this, Cecilie, all kinds of Israeli Jewish historians who today, who experts on the Holocaust, Ross Siegel, Omer Bartov, others, world experts on genocide, who are calling what happened in Gaza genocide. But nobody in the West talks about that. Nobody in the West quotes them. You never find them. Very rarely. Omer Bartov did have an article in the New York Times. And all the other Israeli historians that have pointed out the misidentification of Jewish history and Zionist history with this victim image, they're disregarded because they threaten the identity that people have grown up with. So that I'm sure Naomi, Cecilie, any of us that are Jewish here and have occasionally had conversations with Jews who are either Zionists or friendly to Zionism or are just unaware. It's not even that it goes one ear and out the other. It doesn't even go in one ear. They can't hear because it threatens their identity. So the problem with creating new stories is we have to let go of the identification. And that's the most difficult thing, is to let go of the identity. And that identity, as we've been talking about, and as Naomi points out in her Guardian article, is rooted in trauma, in a trauma story. And those of us that speak outside that story, we're seen as either traitors or sellouts or self-haters or insane. And that's the challenge. And of course, this happens in a context where, again, as Naomi points out, it's a colonial mentality that infuses North American and Western thinking on these subjects. And that colonial mentality does not permit the narrative of the colonized to enter into the conversation. So you go to a country like Germany, where you think they know something about genocide, you think they know something about injustice and oppression. It's almost forbidden in Germany to speak about Palestine. They've learned nothing. And again, I'm talking about identification here. So I'll stop here now. And of course, what we haven't said anything about is the tremendous trauma that's just been inflicted on the Palestinians. I mean, there were articles in medical journals 20, 25 years ago about how traumatized Palestinian children were. This is before Operation Cast Lead, before Operation Protective Edge, before the current horror. And these kids were already severely traumatized. What can we imagine is going to happen in the future? I'll stop there.
Yeah. I think we have to keep returning to that question and maybe in a circuitous route, get back there. And I want to bring this to the issue of structures and Naomi and what you wrote about. And, you know, our good friend John A. Powell always says we go hard on structures, soft on people, because structures are actually the things that carry so much, the majority of the harm, and they can be invisible. And we are trained as humans to look at people and say, you're a good person, you're a bad person, but we are all enmeshed in these structures. And the thing I think you did so incredibly in this article that was so meticulously researched, I thought I knew this topic, I did not at all, until I read what you surfaced from invisibility, from the shadows, was a structure, an active structure and system of deliberate traumatization.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about some of what you saw, some of the findings, and how that relates to what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, I can try, and I would say that, I mean, there's a way in which even talking about this feels obscene in the context of what Gabor just said. they're related, though. That the structures that I was reporting on in the piece, about how what I call trauma transference, not re-traumatization, right? Because re-traumatization implies that you experience the original trauma. It's the discourse of sort of PTSD and re-triggering, right? But what I was reporting on in the piece was how the very real trauma experienced by people directly impacted by October 7th, what was disseminated around the world and kind of transferred from bodies, from one body to the next, right? In these like VR reenact, like you can, it's all of this discourse around immersive experience, right? So you go to an exhibition where you're made to feel like you're at the Novo Festival, all the sound and video and piles of lost items and some the curators will explain that they want you to feel like you experience the trauma yourself, and people come out saying, I feel completely traumatized, right? Or a quote unquote verbatim play that is just text messages and audio messages from October 7th, and people say, I feel like I was there. It was like it happened to me, right? That is deliberate, and it happened extremely quickly. And the reason it happened quickly is because it followed the well-worn grooves of the way in which the experience of the Holocaust has been created, like these immersive experiences, like a walk-in cattle car and things like this, right? And the reason why it's related to the atrocities and the ongoing genocide in Palestine, and as we were talking before, it's in a sense it's widening and moving under this so-called ceasefire to the West Bank. I mean, it was already there, but now it's escalating in the West Bank. Is that the more the trauma of October 7th is repeated on this kind of a loop and spread to more and more people around the world, not only to Jews in the so-called diaspora, but anybody who there were these screenings of the Israeli government organized these screenings almost immediately. They cut together a kind of a highlight reel of the worst of October 7th in order to put people into this highly traumatized sort of unthinking space. Is that when you're in that state, you're not really capable of compassion for anyone else, right? You feel like it's happening to you. So one of the things that I was most struck by was the emergence of this October 7th, what's sometimes called dark tourism. Like it's bringing people to the site of the Novo Music Festival, bringing them to kibbutzim like Be'eri which have, like, the Israeli government doesn't want these sites to be rebuilt. They want that to turn them into what they're calling heritage sites. And it's all modeled off of March of the Living tours. And in fact, they're now being packaged together. So you go to Auschwitz and then you take a plane and you go to Israel, and then you go and you walk through the parts of the kibbutz that are still in rubble. You go to the Novo Music Festival and you have this bodily experience of continuity, as if and it's the same, right? And what I was really struck by, a report by Maya Rosen for Jewish Currents about she went on several of these tours, and she said that she could actually feel the reverberations of the bombs in Gaza. But people who were in their trauma state and they couldn't admit to themselves that it was happening, right? And so we have to understand that this trauma transference industry is about not being able, and here I am, like, I have no business talking about this with Gabor present, what I know from good trauma therapy is that it tries to take you out of that state. Right? Like, it tries to say, you're safe now, right? So, I mean, my question is for like Gabor, as somebody who has worked with traumatized communities, it's like, what is this? Like, it seems like it is the opposite of everything we know about what good treatment of trauma is. Like, it's like you would study it and do the exact opposite on a massive scale. So you try to disseminate trauma. Yeah.
Exactly. So when I work with Indigenous communities in Canada, which I do a lot, we have to acknowledge the history. The history, I don't have to tell anybody here, is atrocious. And the present is atrocious in so many ways. But the work of trauma healing is precisely to help people disidentify from their traumatized identification. That trauma literally means wound. That's what the word means. And nobody is their woundedness. Everybody's got the capacity to heal. That's just part of human nature. That's part of life. And trauma healing is about helping people find that capacity for healing or wholeness within themselves, despite what happened to them. Whereas what you're describing in that article is getting people to identify with what happened to them and with a particular version of what happened to them. Now, let's acknowledge a couple of things. There is something unique about the Nazi genocide of Jews in that if you look at colonial genocide, it was to gain land or to gain power, to gain resources. In the case of the Albigensians, these heretics in 13th century France, it was to give religious to papal authority. The Nazi sanity infused by hatred.
Gabor, I think you should do audio only. We're missing bits.
Oh, okay, all right. You don't like seeing my face. I understand.
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't either. Okay, here we are. So the Nazi genocide, insofar as it was directed against young children and babies and the elderly, it wasn't against any threat, and it wasn't to gain territory or wealth. It was literally to obliterate an imagined threat. It was sort of like the epitome of everything you can say about a traumatized consciousness inflicting trauma on others. So we have to acknowledge that there was something unique about that. There's nothing quite like that in history that I can think of. At the same time, it did happen in a historical context, and it happened in a certain place. And as you said, Naomi, Hitler actually looked to the American West as a model. He consciously said so. And he looked to the Armenian genocide, and he said, Hitler literally said, nobody talks about the Armenians anymore. The world will get over this too, so that even though the anti-Jewish genocide did have some unique ideological features, it did happen in the context of history. So it doesn't put it outside of history. And the attempt is always to put it outside history. And to go back to your comment, Naomi, trauma healing is to help people disidentify from their history, to find the strength in themselves in the present moment, not to keep telling them that you're constantly victimized. You always will be. You always have to be vigilant and defensive and hostile. That's not trauma healing. That's entrenching of trauma. And as regards the people that go to these exhibits and they say, I'm re-traumatized, well, they might have experienced pain, grief, stress. That's not trauma. Not everything that's painful and stressful and griefful is traumatizing. Traumatizing is when you're wounded all over again. And this Jewish identification with this trauma narrative wounds people from one generation to the next, and that wounding begins as soon as school begins or even before. And that's what we're dealing with here. And it begins around the holidays, where every generation people will rise up against us. It begins with, it's okay to kill or to see the killing of Egyptian firstborn for our own salvation. That's perfectly okay. It's okay to inflict plagues on other people. That's perfectly okay. because we're so traumatized, we're such victims. And by the way, I got news for you. The Egyptian captivity never happened. No such thing. There were no Jews in Egypt that were in captivity. There was no exodus from Egypt. There's zero archaeological, historical, or philological evidence for it. It never happened. And I could go on and on about just that. So again, it's a question of concoction of stories that keep people within the trauma framework. I'll stop here.
I know we're going to go to questions soon, Seth, but I just wanted to jump in on a couple of points. One, I had a really interesting conversation with Gabor's son, Daniel, for their excellent podcast, Bad Hasbara, a few months ago. And, Daniel, who co-wrote The Myth of Normal with Gabor. And we were talking about the instrumentalization of trauma around statecraft, right? That part of it is that there is this, you don't stay with the trauma. It immediately gets turned into a political purpose, right? So, I mean, I remember this from my own education. It was like immersed in the horror. They've always hated us. They will always hate us. Exposing kids far too young to really graphic details, and then the Israeli national anthem and happy ending, right? So it's just like it slaps it onto the horror and makes it okay, right? And this is something that I know that anybody who has very personal experiences with trauma knows, and that's most people, and some people more than others. There's no happy ending, and this is what Daniel and I were talking about, is that actually we live with it our whole lives, and we have better days and worse days. And it's this kind of Hollywoodization of the Holocaust, right? Where it's like absolute horror, but here's the happy ending, right? And so if you've never actually confronted what it means, then the idea of losing the happy ending is also incredibly destabilizing, because then it forces a reckoning that never really happened, because when something is instrumentalized, you're not really staying with it. You're not really doing that work.
You're not grieving.
Yeah, because you're just, the feelings are just a plot point, right? They're a means to an end.
Well, if I jump in, Naomi, for a moment, apropos of what you just said, the Hollywoodization, the happy ending, Steven Spielberg, of course, who runs the Shoah Project, and who that you'd reference in your article, he directs this film called Schindler's List, which itself is a distortion of what actually happened, but most of the film is in black and white when it takes place in Poland. At the end of the film, it gets colorized, and all these people are marching towards Israel in pure living color. I mean, there could not be a better example of what you just said.
Look, there's a lot to talk about, including injured masculinity in a lot of this, because I think about somebody like Claude Lanzmann, who made, the original miniseries Shoah. And here I just wanted to quickly say, this is now being reinscribed again with yet another Hollywood blockbuster called The Brutalist, which, if you haven't seen it, please don't. It's terrible, but it reinscribes this same narrative of endless persecution, injured masculinity that we saw in Exodus, right? Talking about rape in the camps and immediately put your hand on the Bible and swear allegiance to the Irgun. That's your therapy, right? Now, once again, in Brutalist, spoiler alert, another male rape and another fix it with Zionism, okay? So that Hollywood's working overtime right now on this, and it's very important that we understand it. But I want to return to this point around here, there is no why. Okay, so that is a phrase that Primo Levi, who was a Holocaust, an Auschwitz survivor, he was quoting a prison guard, that was what they said if any of the prisoners of Auschwitz asked what was happening or what was or why, the answer was, here there is no why, right? So then Lanzmann appropriates a term from from an Auschwitz guard and applies it to the Holocaust as a whole. So this is part of the forbidding of comparison, is you're not actually allowed. We haven't been allowed to really try to understand this beyond primordial Jewish hatred, right? So I would actually, I don't know if I want to disagree or just question this idea that there wasn't an economic reason for the Holocaust in the same way that there was a clear economic reason for colonialism. What you were saying earlier, Gabor, like, that's something Arendt said. That's a distinction Arendt made at the time. But I also think that we need to spend more time questioning it. Like we need to ask the why. And if we ask the why, I think we might find some whys around, okay, 1929, capitalism experiences its greatest crisis in history. We're a decade out of the Russian Revolution, and communism is spreading around the world. There was, even if it wasn't the same kind of colonial pillage, although certainly Jewish property was pillaged, there was certainly a need to have an internal enemy to save capitalism, right? And the way the Nazis made a distinction between Jewish capitalism, and which was the perverted capitalism, and real good capitalism, right? They need, I think the Holocaust saved capitalism in lots of ways, which is why the German industrialists aligned with the Nazis. And frankly, the images that we saw yesterday at inauguration with the billionaires lining up behind Trump were eerily reminiscent of that moment. So I think there was a why, and I think it was a huge economic reason on a kind of macro scale.
No, listen. To be clear, there's all kinds of economic, social, political reasons for German anti-Semitism, for Nazism, and ultimately for the Holocaust. All I said, there was no immediate gain in that particular killing of Jewish children. And by the way, let's recognize something: the Nazis did not set out to murder the Jews. They set out to marginalize them, and Hitler's idea was to expel them, send them to Madagascar or some other place. And we can go back to Palestine here, because it's not that the Israeli state or the Zionist project wants to kill all the Palestinians. They just want to expel them. They'll just kill as many as they have to. But, so that even the Nazi genocide didn't start off with that genocidal intention. But then it has, as you said earlier, any colonial or any imperial project's got its own internal logic. And if you look at the genocide that's recently taking place, Israelis would be quite happy. When I say Israelis, I mean the Zionist establishment would be quite happy just to see all the Palestinians go to Madagascar. But if they won't, we'll kill as many as we have to.
Thanks, Gabor and Naomi. I want to ask questions about what is called for today, maybe in an almost a parallel reality where Palestinians have all of the support they need, and Jews and Israelis. What does a state built around what does it look like to have a state that actually deeply cares about healing of trauma? What is that? I don't know if we know what that looks like, but I want to go to questions of the audience. We have half an hour, and we're going to try, I think, Zaya and Maurizio, can you bring Yvette online so she can ask her questions?
Yvette?
Yes, 1 second.
Yes, 1
Let's
second.
see. Okay.
Or I can read the question.
Let's
you
probably
could
read the question, because I don't think she's ready.
Okay, let's do that.
Let's read it.
With an eye to world building and healing, what is your advice on balancing creating new or authentic narratives to disarm the weaponized ones, or just to stand on their own? Do we need to counter to stem the tide of hate and self-harm, or do we generate truths that can hold and sustain us? This is for, yeah.
Wait, where can I read that question?
Q&A.
Q&A, sorry, I just
We just
answered
marked
it.
it
So
answered.
Oh.
Let me get it back.
Okay,
mark
I,
it.
I will switch.
If you go to answered box, you will see Yvette
Okay.
is the third down on the line.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this question around narrative, I don't think we should, I mean, choosing whether we repair the ones that got us into this mess versus telling new ones. I mean, I think it's really, it's not a rupture. It's not like, I don't think we abandon everything we ever knew and we're never going to be a blank slate. So I think often it's a work of reinterpretation. You know, we've talked about the Passover story. There's another way of telling parts of that story that are really about like Jewish Egyptian solidarity and feminist heroism and raising children who are not your blood children as your own. I mean, there's different parts of history that we can pull out. But you know, considering how much we're looking back at these old stories, I do think we need to look forward. And it's always sort of part of an excavation. You know, Gabor was saying about you're not your trauma, right? And I think that a part of it is about knowing who you maybe were before that rupture point too, right? My friend Molly Crabapple has written this exquisite book. It'll be out in a year, I think, and she's revising it now, on the Jewish labor Bund, called Here, well, the working title is Here Where We Live Is Our Country, which was a Bund slogan. And it's this idea of doikat, here-ness. And I think there's something in this idea of really committing to here and what it would mean, not only for Jews, but I think we all have traditions, ancestral traditions of here-ness, of truly loving where we are, and understanding those systems of reciprocity. And I think there's that decolonization and taking leadership from Indigenous people is a huge part of this. But I think we also need to find our own ancient traditions around this and pool our collective wisdom and tell new stories, not just revert to old stories. And, you know, when I look at, not to come back to the horrors of Inauguration Day again, but, you know, when I look at these would-be space colonizers, you know, and that lineup of tech billionaires with Trump, none of them believe in this planet, you know. They are willing to torch it, literally torch it, when you look at Trump's executive orders and the rolling back of every climate policy. I mean, they are arsonists, and it intersects with their apocalypticism, their end timesism, their Christian Zionism. Some of them are like literalists, Bible literalists, and they're actually excited about the end times, and the worse things get, the more it's a sign that it's all going to burn, and they can't wait because, you know, the group of the chosen people are going to be lifted up in an elevator to a golden city in the sky. But that's just a biblical version of what these guys are actually building down here with their gilded bunkers, and the fact that their extreme wealth makes them think that they're gods. So I think we need to understand the perversions of that narrative and what it is actually producing, like in terms of the sort of narrative grooves that makes a guy like Elon Musk believe that he can go to Mars, right? Or this so-called long-termism ideology that the Silicon Valley people believe in, some of them around like, well, everyone's going to die anyway, so we just need to protect a few. Like these are these same biblical stories, right? But just secularized. Meanwhile, AI, which they're all, you know, tripling down on, is really about creating a kind of a mirror world of this world by sucking all the water, energy, jobs out of it. So this is an apocalyptic vision of the world. It is about theirness. It is about putting all of their hopes in some other place than this beautiful sacred place. And so I think that there's a story that needs to be woven that is really about committing to this world. And I think it is a multiracial, multi-generational, multi-faith story that also is about liberating all of our spiritual practices from these state projects that have perverted them and destroyed them. So those are a few ideas for stories.
Just a couple of quick points. One is what you said, Naomi, about reclaiming history. So you mentioned the Bund, which was this large Jewish labor socialist organization in Eastern Europe, Poland, and so on, much larger than the Zionist movement was. And when you look at the uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto, the top leader was a left-wing Zionist, Mordechai Anaelewicz. After he was killed, the second in command was Merrick Edelman, who was a Bund or a Jewish socialist. Now, Edelman is one of the few who survived. He fought against the Nazis throughout the war. And after the war, he became a cardiologist, a very principled man. He supported and joined the Solidarity Labor Movement against the communist government later on, but he was a lifelong supporter of Palestinian rights and the Palestinian struggle. He's never mentioned in Jewish historiography. In Israel, there are no streets and no kibbutzim and no squares, no statues. In other words, they whitewash out of history anybody who doesn't fit in with the Zionist narrative. And so I think that we have to reclaim history from that point of view, number one. In terms of the future, you know, I think it's more like what Naomi said at the very end of her contribution here. For me, it's not a matter of narratives. It's a matter of consciousness and who's telling the narrative. And we're heading into dark times. History goes through these dark cycles. We've been through them before. Can we hold on to our sense of ourselves beyond just what happened to us and be beyond just what our minds tend to believe? Can we have a deeper connection to everything? I mean, when you talk about commitment to the earth, you're talking about commitment to reality and to the world. And can we find that in ourselves? I think much of my life resisted sort of spiritual path as a kind of a cop-out from the real world, you know what? I no longer see it that way. I think at this point, we really have to look for our two essential selves, because that's the only thing that's going to get us through. We're going heading into dark times. I mean, today's executive orders or yesterday's executive orders is just the beginning. And it was bad enough even before Trump returned to power. It's going to be dark times. Can we hold on to our faith, to our trust in each other, to our, as Gramsci famously said, our pessimism of the intellect, but optimism of the will? I mean, I think that's the key.
Thank you, Gabor and Naomi. I'm going to go now to video. I see I'm figuring this out. So I'm going to have two folks, Evelyn and then Linda, ask questions, and then we'll go back to the Q&A box. So Evelyn, we'll put you on first, and then I think we'll have Linda.
Thank you so much for your contribution, all three of you. What I'm struck with is the role of compassion in trauma. And I think what I'm not hearing in this conversation is, what I'm hearing is a binary, compassion for one side. And I'm not advocating that we only have to be compassionate towards the Jewish people. But I'm suggesting that to have that compassion for us as a people. And at the same, I think that I truly believe there will be more integrity in that. And I think that the movement will be more held in greater respect and regard if we can hold compassion for our own people. And I'm speaking as a Jewish American and has lived in Israel for 13 years. And I feel very deeply with all my work with Palestine Museum US, Palestine Museum of Natural History in Bethlehem, with Mazin Kumsia, building these meaningful relationship. It comes from a deep place of thinking about my own people and what's best for my own people. So I'm wondering what remarks I'm welcome to hear your thoughts.
Well, first of all, I think you're pointing to something very real. When we're confronting such horrors as has been inflicted on the Palestinians for the last 3/4 of a century in the name of Jews, in the name of my name, in all of our names, my tendency is to get in touch with all kinds of anger and sometimes the compassion is lacking from the way I speak about things. So first of all, thanks for pointing that out. Okay, number one. And I've taken responsibility for that, when I can. Number one. Number two, in my book, Myth and Normal, I talk about compassion, and one of the levels of compassion is the compassion of truth. Now, I firmly believe that Zionism is going to be seen as a major disaster in Jewish history, by Jewish history, in the not too distant future. Not necessarily in my lifetime, but certainly it will be. You'll be seen like the zealots whose activities led to the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 AD. So the most compassionate thing I can think of is to tell people, wake up, this is what's going on. The direction that you're going in is leading into disaster. It's leading to the drying up of your soul and the creation of a catastrophe. I'm not going to go into the reasons, but Hannah Arendt said in 1942 that it's insanity for the Zionists to put their trust in foreign powers far away and completely alienate the people amongst whom they have to live. But of course, Zionism could not have survived unless it did that. So inherently, it's a project that's going to end in disaster. So I think that's very compassionate to let our fellow Jews know, listen, the direction you're going in is not only causing unspeakable suffering for these other people, it's going to be a catastrophe for us as well. Let me just go back to a question of tone, though, and because it's true. It's sometimes difficult for me, I don't know what it's like for Cecilie and Naomi, to maintain a kind of compassionate softness towards my own people when I see them supporting such horrors. That's on me. And you're very right to point it out. Okay?
Yeah, I think it's a great point, Evelyn. I mean, I do believe Cecilie framed us in a really beautiful way. So I just want to acknowledge that, not defensively, but just say that we did begin from a place of deep compassion. And in terms of the article of mine that keeps getting referenced, I start with the families who didn't want their trauma weaponized in this way, who told Netanyahu to get lost, who boycotted all their official, memorializations precisely because it had nothing to do with their loved ones. So I apologize for not reiterating that it's not about, saying you can't mourn. It's about the weaponization, instrumentalization of trauma. I've been critical, of parts of the solidarity movement here that, have sort of denied that right to grieve of all people, But I guess I don't totally identify with your framing of my people and their people. Like maybe I'm too much of like a whatever you want to call it, a humanist or whatever. But I did grieve the killings on October 7th. I wrote a piece for The Guardian that was quite controversial. Stand with the child, not the gun. No matter whose child, no matter whose gun. And that's the way I see it. I didn't grieve the people who were killed on October 7th because they were my people. I grieved them because they were people, and I'm not, and I want to ask that of the left, of the movements that I'm a part of. And I also want to say, I've never I absolutely feel what Gabor was expressing about the pain of having a genocide perpetuated in the name of our safety and the need to separate ourselves. But at the same time, I've also never felt more Jewish. So I'm filled with contradictions in that I've never felt more a part of a Jewish community than I have over these past horrific, 16 months, because of groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, who have created containers for my Jewishness, and so much love for Cecilie for being one of the people who built that organizations, who held us not just as opponents of what Israel is doing, but gave us spaces to have seders in the streets and, and to retell to reimagine our ceremonies in ways that felt meaningful to us. So thank you. It's complicated.
Thank you so much. I appreciate all of you, and I appreciate your question, Evelyn. And I'm going to go on to Linda.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi,
Yeah.
everyone. Thank you so much. This is really enlightening. And Naomi and Gabor, you've both been a huge influence on my life for a very long time. So I feel very privileged to be here. I'm a Palestinian in the diaspora. I am a storyteller and a filmmaker. And it's really meaningful for me to be in a Jewish space and to hear this perspective and the way you frame the weaponization, and you talk about this history. And I'm wondering, what can we, like as Palestinians, what can we learn? What lessons can we take from this in order to help our community, who's obviously has been undergoing and undergone this huge traumatic experience? So how can we help them and each other to heal and tell new stories? Because I agree that we need to tell new stories, and I think so much is about narrative and building stories in the future to counter all the hate. So I'm wondering what your perspective is on that.
I am very reluctant to give advice to Palestinians because, well, I'm just reluctant to do that. If I had a wish, because when you're under such pressure, such threats, such constant assault, not just in Palestine, but in the United States as well, and in the Western world in general, it'd be the height of arrogance for people not in your situation to tell you what to do. So I really think that, and there's so much that I've drawn by way of inspiration in Palestinian resilience and Sumud, and their dances, your songs, your poetry, your sheer commitment to life. There's a lot that you could teach the West and the rest of us. If I had a wish, it would be this. I mentioned Eric Edelman. I don't know how you're going to feel about this, but Eric Edelman was the Jewish leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising who supported Palestinian struggle all his life. When he died at age of 90, barely anybody in Israel even mentioned his death. But he was critical of the Palestinian struggle because of the suicide bombings and the attacks on civilians. If I had a wish, and I'm not telling you what to do, if I had a wish, I wish I heard more Palestinians talk about how that's not what we stand for. And that's, I can understand it. I'm not saying I don't know where that comes from. And Palestinians did not initiate the terrorism in Palestine. I know all the history. But at the same time, if I had a wish, it'd be a bit more recognition of some of the aspects of the resistance that have horrified people around the world and have fed into the Zionist narrative. I say this with some hesitation, but since you ask, that would be a wish. How do you feel about that?
I agree with you, to be honest. And I think it's easy for me as somebody in the diaspora who has the distance, who hasn't, experienced living under occupation, it's very easy for me to be able to see that. And I'm not sure. I mean, when I go to the West Bank or speak to family or friends that live there, it's obviously their experience is so much more complicated than mine. But I do agree that there is sometimes a lack of reflection and self-critique because we are so swept up in our own victimization and injustice against us. So, and this is a conversation I have, not to speak too long, but this is a conversation that I have with other filmmaker friends who are Palestinians, who in the diaspora especially, that we need to tell new stories about us also. We've been telling the same story over and over again. And obviously it hasn't worked. So we need to tell new stories. We need to tell different stories about joy, about love, about life, and not just about injustice. And part of that is facing uncomfortable realities. So I do agree with you.
By the way, I don't know if you realize, but that photograph behind you of the Beatles crossing the street there, there's a version of it online in color with John Lennon holding a Palestinian flag.
I've seen it. And my Palestinian children are sitting on the floor listening to this conversation.
Good. All right.
Linda, one thing I would just, thank you so much for being part of this conversation, which has been so beautiful, by the way. I'm already sad for it to end. I think that it is so difficult to have the kinds of conversations that we're talking, like Gabor was just mentioning, that in the middle of a genocide. And I have so many, Palestinian friends who have, been in this state. And I think that, many of us in the movement have this feeling of like, okay, first we have to get through this, and then we're going to have some of these more difficult conversations. And I think that's entirely appropriate. The difficulty, of course, is what Gabor just said about, if we really are entering, if this is an era, not an event, right? Then we have to develop the skills, and we're not the first people to have to do it, to have those very difficult conversations in the teeth of it, right? We can't delay it endlessly, right? Because the fact is, it's only some people who are censoring themselves, right? There's lots of people who are talking very loudly from a very particular point of view and not worried about criticizing other people, and including other Palestinians. And so, I teach university students, and I'm very aware of how quickly a discourse can just become the dominant discourse, right? If you're 20 and you got involved in politics last year, then this is the only discourse you've seen. So all the people who've been saying, oh, we'll talk about it later, we just have to get through this, that wasn't legible to a whole generation now that has gotten involved in politics. The only thing legible were the people who had no compunction about trashing their own, right? So that is something we have to, I think it's less about having the fights with each other, and more about building the alternative spaces that we want, making it legible, giving people a choice of a different kind of tendency to join. And I think lots of people are starting to do that and are ready to do that.
Thank you, Linda, so much. We're going to go to, we're coming to the close. We clearly need another 8 hours to have these conversations, but I'm going to invite Yassine. I see your image, to ask your question. I think it would be a great question to close with. Hassan, yeah.
Hi, yeah, I have the question, and I also, as a Palestinian diaspora, wanted to make.
Sorry.
Hello?
Yasin, we're gonna bring Yasin. Hold on,
Yasin
let's add a
Hassan.
spotlight. There is this. Okay, Yasin, can we unmute you? There you are. Okay. Thank you.
Hello. I'm very nervous asking the question just because I think like others have been very inspired by Gabor and Naomi. So short of breath, but I want to get my question out. So
Take a breath.
Please take
Take a breath.
breath. We can all take a deep breath together.
thank you. So my father's Egyptian, born in Cairo, Muslim. My mother's a British Jew. I live in London. This conflict has been a part of my life since I was 3 years old. It's the reason they divorced is because of this conflict. I'm also a therapist. And so one thing that's really stood out to me from this conversation today is what Gabor mentioned earlier about how much of this is unconscious in terms of the responses that a lot of Jews across the world are having, the defenses. There's so much here that's unconscious. And my question basically just is, if so much of this is unconscious, and if we're being honest, most people in the world, so many Israelis and Jews and Palestinians won't have trauma, long-term trauma therapy, healing work. Like, how do we, I'm not expecting a concrete answer because I've sensed that it's just not concrete, but how do we move forward if so much of this is unconscious?
Well, you can't penetrate people's unconscious by any kind of a frontal assault of reality, truth, historical facts. None of that will be absorbed or penetrate. So don't try to do what you can't do. I think we're talking about a long-term project here. I think we're talking about, to go back to Naomi's analysis, a systemic situation where we're looking at a whole colonial imperial structure that keeps generating more and more traumatized people who keeps escaping into their unconscious or defended by their unconscious from facing reality. The good news is that more and more people are waking up. As the crisis of the system deepens, so is increasing the number of people who are asking questions, who want a different explanation, who are open to a different narrative, who are willing to examine themselves. I don't think we can have the agenda of breaking into people's unconscious. What our agenda is, I think, as I understand it, is just to keep the light of truth burning. And then people will gravitate towards it in time. And, you know, that great Jewish rabbi, was it Hillel, who said that the task is not yours to finish? Well, he said that 2,100 years ago. That task of healing the world, it's not finished. But look at all the people who've made inspiring and essential, indispensable contributions to keeping that light burning. And each in our own small ways, that's what we can do. And we can't force anything. You can't hurry history. We can't will other people's transformation. But we can keep speaking, and as somebody pointed out, with as much compassion and as truth as possible, and have some faith that eventually more and more people will be ready to open up. That's what I have to say on that.
Naomi, would you like to bring us home for the morning?
Yeah, such a profound question. And we're not gonna win every battle, right, on this. But I do think that just I've been the space for a long time of the Jewish side of the solidarity movement, and it's just been it's been a huge generational shift, right? So I can't believe that it isn't possible to change consciousness. And then you think about what's happening inside families, of parents being confronted with by their own children, which is often, what we know from the climate issue is that kids are the most likely to change their parents' minds. For some reason, particularly daughters. So I think part of why it's important to make visible the infrastructures that make people afraid. Like you're afraid because people want you to be afraid, right? And some people will never respond to that, but I think some people will, right? Especially if it's paired with a lived bodily experience of another kind of safety and solidarity, which is why movement building matters. Because when we build movements, and when we build beautiful movements, and we build movements based on real principles of solidarity and compassion, and the sanctity of life, when people participate in those movements in their actual bodies, in the actual world, they get new memories, right? That can counter the stories that we've been telling, right? And so the culture that's why it matters, the culture that we build in movements, and why even when we feel very tired and defeated and overwhelmed, which is exactly how we're supposed to feel when we're being bombarded from all directions, which is why they're using this shock and awe strategy. We have to build movements, and we have to invest in that culture, which will give people some other types of experiences to draw on.
Thank you, Naomi. Thank you, Gabor. Thank you, Yasin. And I end with this note that I got from one of you who's watching. Please, 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 can we have a part 2 to this conversation? We are almost out of time, and there's so much more to learn. So maybe we can consider that.
I would do it in a heartbeat, Gabor. I don't know about you, but like I'm looking at some of these questions that are going unanswered and just feeling like I hope we're archiving them. And, I don't know. I would love to. This is such a special community. Thank you so much. And I really apologize to everyone who didn't get their question responded to.
Well, perhaps if we do it again, we could devote the whole time to dealing with people's questions.
Yeah.
And anyway, listen, you guys, I got to run for another engagement. So thank you, Naomi, Cecilie, Zaya, Maurizio, everybody who participated, contributed. Hope to see you next time. Bye.
Thank you so much. And Donzi, next time, if we do it again, which we will, you're our first question. Thank you. Bye all.
Thanks all.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
you.
Naomi. Thank you, Cecilie, for the wonderful hosting. And thank you to the SEN team for making this event possible. Lisa, Carlos, Jean-Ric,
Sarah.
Michael, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. And this will be continued. We'll have a part 2 session, conversation. Thank you, everyone.